Hi, welcome back to Spring CS170. Just wanted to pick up from where we left off last time with the JavaScript. So we have this as part of extra credit. You can kind of go through, try to do what we were talking about. And, if you encounter some troubles that, um, how to do certain things, I'll try to make a video clip of it. Right, send me an email, tell me like where you're getting stuck at, and I'll try to cut some videos because hopefully that benefits everybody in the class. But my intent is to have you be able to write up all of this and use this for reference when you go into your exam. Okay, so you remember this from last time. That was in the last video. So let's get into the function. So this is chapter 19. So what is a function? So basically, you look at functions as sort of like a way to organize your code so that it can be referenced. The same piece of code or that same function can be referenced in many different places. Um, it's reusable, right? So you don't want to be in a situation where, let's say in this case, we're talking about pizza, right? So make dough, make sauce, and then make the pizza. um, you don't want to have, let's say, the sauce, whatever the recipe is to make the sauce. Uh, you don't want to have like a different copy of like that same recipe like all over the place, right? So I write it down once, I write it on a piece of paper, that's my recipe, right, to make the sauce, and then I write it down somewhere else, right? And then I maybe use that one, maybe I use the one that I left laying around from before. Uh, so there's multiple copies of like that same recipe that's laying around all over the place. Now you don't want that, right? Because how do you know, like, is it the right recipe? Maybe it's like a recipe that you tried earlier and you found out for some reason it doesn't quite work. You need to tweak the ingredients or something like that. You don't know which one is right when you look at it. And likewise, if your friend wants to get a copy of that recipe, um, how are they going to get at it, right? Are you going to write another piece of paper and give it to them? You're going to maybe give them a link to, let's say you wrote a HTML page or a website to have your recipe, and then you just give them that link, right? And so maybe later on you have like this magical, like awesome, like new ingredient to put into the sauce. Then you make that change right there, just in that one function, right? And everybody else will see it, right? You don't, if you make multiple copies of this stuff all over the place, you never know who has the right version. Okay, so that's the idea of having like a function so that other people can reference it. There will be one place for you to make the change, and then everybody benefits from that change. So that's the idea of having a function. And basically, it just uh, when you perform the function, you don't. Well, when you write the code and you look at it, like people don't want to see that same recipe, like all of the details over and over again. All they want to say is like, oh, okay, this is what I need to do. I'm gonna make the sauce, right? And that's it. So it sort of makes the high level code more easy to read also. So, you see here, like making the pizza is three functions: make the dough, make the sauce, make the pizza. Now, within that, there's like, more details. There's more steps in it. Like there's more steps to make dough, make sauce, and make pizza. But then if I look at all of those details, people will see like a very long series of steps and recipe, right? Versus like you just have 3 lines. 3 lines would be, one is to make dough, one is to make sauce, and one is to make pizza. Okay, uh, so those are the reasons why you would have like functions, and generally there's some equivalent of that, like in many programming languages. Okay, so what does that mean in JavaScript? So in JavaScript, you have a block of code. Uh, it's usually designed to perform one particular task. That's an important point there, right? So if you write a function, uh, number one, you're going to name that function to match up to whatever it is you plan to do. right? So I think like in like the 2 lectures ago, I showed you the different math functions. One of them is to generate a random number, okay? Now, if you actually had this function doing a couple of different things other than random number, um, okay, so what do you call the name of the function? And, you know, in terms of like making it easier to piece together things like Lego blocks, so that you can reuse things easier within your code, you don't want to jam a whole bunch of functionality into a function. You just make sure it does one thing and does it well, and then everybody can refer to that, knowing clearly what does it do, right? So that's the reason, right? Now, there's nothing enforcing it. You can jam like a ginormous like function and jam a whole bunch of different stuff in there, but that's not really a good practice. Okay, so ideally you want the function of code to do one task only, right, and do it well. All right, um, and as it mentions here, using functions manages the complexity of programs. Right, if you had no functions, you just write like a big block of code. Um, you're gonna have a heck of a time maintaining that code, right? And reading through it, understand what it does. Versus like, remember this example here, make dough, make sauce, make pizza. Boom, right there, you know right away what's going on, right? You don't necessarily need to understand all the different details underneath each of these functions, um, but you get the idea very quickly, right? So managing the complexity of programs is a key point on functions, okay? And as I mentioned before, the reuse of code, right? So like I said, if you have like a function you want to share with other people, if you define that library and other people can access to it, then that's great. Everybody understands how to make that pizza or make the sauce, right? And like I said, if you decide to make that change to improve that function, right away everybody would benefit from it, right? You don't have to say, oh, I gave a copy of this to so-and-so and I have to remember to give them the update. You don't have to do any of that. You just do it one place and everybody will automatically get the update, okay? So that's the whole point about the reuse of code. Right? So creating a function, okay? So this is what I would say you can call creating function. I would say it's declaring your function. Similar way, I draw the analogy to you creating your variable, right? So here you're gonna say function, right? This to tell the computer you're gonna create a function. Right now you want to name the function, right? So this is like converting Celsius to Fahrenheit, okay? And then does your function have some parameters? Those are your input, right? So in this case, you want to take in the temperature in Celsius, right? So then you have this open paren, the name of the variable, and then the close paren, right? And then you have these curly brackets and then dot, dot, dot in there. That's just basically the code or the logic within this function to actually do the conversion of Celsius to Fahrenheit. Okay, here's some other examples of functions in here. One is like to calculate the coin flip, heads or tails. Um, this is like converting from Fahrenheit to Celsius, right? This is to calculate BMI, um, put in the weight and put in your height, okay? So this is more about creating a function. So again, you have the command to do it, you have the name here, you have the input parameter, but now you're seeing the actual logic inside of it. And it's just like any other JavaScript code, right? So here you have the variable, right? You're defining with var, result is the name, equals to, and then you say, you remember this from our earlier lectures when we were doing the Fahrenheit to Celsius or vice versa conversions, you have that, right? So 9/5 times the temp in C, right? So this is the variable that you declared up here. This comes into here and add 32. And then you're going to do a return of the result. Okay, so you'll see later on when we talk about calling a function what that means here, right? This is the part of you declaring or creating the function. And this end part here where it says the return, that's how it returns the result. Now, is this the only way for you to pass information back and forth between like the main program and the function? No, it's not. But this would be the recommended way of doing things so that it's easier to follow the code and understand what's going on, right? There's many ways to do this, but uh, this is like, it's easy for me to follow. I'll look at the function, I can see what it's doing here, and I can see here, it's returning the result, right? Which is this, which is declared here, okay? So that's nice and easy to follow what's going on, okay? This one is going the other way, right? So this is going from Fahrenheit to Celsius. You have the degrees in Fahrenheit, and you're going to return degrees in Celsius, okay? A little bit inconsistent in the way we wrote this function, right? If you're going to return the result here, I would have declared the result here and returned this. But on the other hand, I would say this is more clear, right? To say degrees in Celsius, right? Degrees C, and return that. So you could argue, if you're going to do it down here, well, you can do here, right? Degrees F, right? Instead of saying result. Okay. All right. So, the parameters, you can think of them just like variables, the way you declare them. So you remember, like at the beginning when we did the introduction to JavaScript, we talked about the different conventions or syntax for declaring variables. What's a legal variable? Those parameters follow those same conventions. Essentially, those parameters are variables, right? As far as you're concerned. So just follow those when you name the parameters going in. And like it says here, they're acting just like normal variables. Okay. Now here is like a little bit of difference. So if you talk about like, well, are parameters and variables exactly the same thing? No, right? So here we go into some of the difference between normal variables and parameters, right? Uh, so you declare a function, and whatever like parameter you declare or variables that you declare within that function, it will last within the lifetime of that function when I call that function, right? But it's not available any other time, okay? So this is something that's kind of important. So make sure that you understand what that means. So I call the function, whatever, like it's your working space, your working variables, essentially you're working with there. You can work with it while you're in that function, but once you're done, which is when you do the return, when I'm up here, once I do this return result and I leave this function, then those things don't exist anymore. I can't just like refer to it. They're not this it's outside the scope of this class, but I'll mention it. Is this idea of like a global variable, right? So I can create global variables, and then people can write, and they'll exist forever, and you can access them anywhere. But generally, global variables are bad practice, right? So that's just an aside, right? I just mentioned it because it was just there, and I figure I should say something, but it's not within the scope of this class. But the idea of global variables, which is in contrast of what you're talking about here with the local variables within these functions. See here, it says local to the function, right? So people might say, well, what's the opposite of that? Well, it's the global variables. So, so that's only within the function you can access the variable, okay? Now this is a tricky bit, and yes, this is true, but I would still be careful because it gets confusing. If you name the same variable multiple times in different functions, technically that works, but I wouldn't do that too much. Sometimes you have no choice, right? Sometimes it just makes sense to name the variables the same, but again, it gets confusing. For a human person, right? Computer doesn't care. Computer will function fine, right? But a human person trying to read this code, if you name the same variables within all these different functions, if you're trying to read through it quickly, you're not quite sure, very quickly, you're not quite sure like what's in those variables. So I think it just avoids confusion if you try to avoid having the same name variable across different functions within your program. Okay, just a rule of thumb. but you can choose to do it. It allows you to do it. There's no problem in doing it. Okay. So you know, this is the important thing to take from this point, right? The way you give the result back is this return and whatever that is, right? It could be your variable, it could be some sort of calculation, right? So in this case, you remember from the Celsius to Fahrenheit conversion, you have the return result, okay? Uh, that's how you pass information back to whatever is calling this function. Okay, so we've been talking about enough, so let's take a look at making the call. So making the call is something like this, right? Just like, let me go back to here. You remember this JSDO. Um, so the on click, right? The double quotes, you have your JavaScript code in here. Well, I'm making a function call here, right? Show random number, open paren, close paren, because there's no variable going in here. So there's the function that I declared, right? So you just call the function just like that. Okay, so that's what this is trying to say here too. Okay, so if you have an argument, in this case you're passing a Celsius argument, then you pass in something like that, like 38 or something, right? So yeah, you have the function name, and then you have the arguments, right? Arguments are passed in into your parameters, right? So when you call it like this is your argument, okay? And then you have on the receiving end, when you're up here, this will be considered a parameter. Okay, so I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, um, so I think I'll mention this. It's a little bit more advanced from a computer science standpoint, but it might be something that might come up in an exam, so maybe I'll just mention it, right? So there's the idea of like passing by value and passing by reference, right? So notice this point here where it says it passes a copy of the data to the parameter. It doesn't actually pass the location of this, right? When we say location, it's kind of like the memory location of the argument, right? And you might say, well, okay, who cares, right? Why is that important? What that means is that if I make changes, like let's say the parameter I pass it in, right? In this case, I pass in a parameter of 38. If I make a change to that 38 and then I get out of that function, it's all good. Like nothing happens really, right? Because it's a copy of the data. But now if I pass a memory location or I pass a reference to the argument here, now if I change to 38, maybe I change it to 40, when I leave the function, I come back to the main program that makes the call, it's still going to stay 40 because I made the change within um, the function directly to where this information is stored at in memory. Okay, I don't know if I really want to go too much more into it. It's a little bit more of a advanced topic, but it's something that might be referred to in exam. Hence why you see this point here where it says pass a copy of the data to the parameter. So it's just something to watch out for. If you're still not clear on what I just said, just drop me a line and I'll maybe try to explain it to you more. You can drop it into my office hours or whatever. Okay. Let's see, still quite a bit more here. So let me just do this one. No, arguments and parameters, it's going to go on for a bit. So let me stop here and I'm going to cut a new video. All right, thank you.